Hello, and welcome to another episode of Architecture Topics. I'm your host, Liam Karen, and today we're heading to post-war Germany, to the city of Berlin in the 1960s. A city still healing from the scars of war, and split in two by the Berlin Wall. But even in those impossible circumstances, a city trying to move forward. Today we're talking about the Neue Nationalgalerie, the last building ever built by the modernist master Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. But before we go there, if you like what we're doing here on Architecture Topics, consider following the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. It's free, it's easy, and it's the best way to help the show keep going and make sure you don't miss future episodes. Excellent. Thanks for that. I really appreciate it. Now, let's travel back to Berlin in the early 1960s, where city officials were trying to reimagine a cultural identity for West Berlin and looking at architecture to help shape it. This wasn't just a design challenge. It was political, psychological, and symbolic. The Berlin Wall had just gone up in 1961. The city was now physically split, with Soviet-controlled East Berlin on one side and the isolated enclave of West Berlin on the other, an island of democracy deep inside East Germany. In this atmosphere of tension and propaganda, culture became a weapon. East Berlin had the prestige of the old museums on Museum Island, the Pergamon, the Altes Museum, all rich with classical history and imperial grandeur. West Berlin needed an answer to that cultural weight from the East. So they began planning a new district of museums, concert halls, and libraries, a modern alternative to the old Prussian heart of the city. It would be called the Kulturforum. This wasn't about nostalgia. It was about signaling that West Berlin was forward-looking, international, sophisticated, and very much alive. And at the center of that vision, they wanted a new gallery for modern art. Something that could represent not just the art of the 20th century, but the values of openness, clarity, and cultural freedom. But who could design it? Who had the authority, the symbolic weight, the architectural language to match that ambition? That's when someone suggested a name that hadn't been spoken much in Germany for over 2 decades, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. By the early 1960s, Mies was no longer the young revolutionary of European modernism. He was 75 years old, living in Chicago, and widely regarded as one of the masters of the international style. The man behind the Seagram Building, the Crown Hall, Farnsworth House, and dozens of crystalline glass towers across the United States. But in Germany, his legacy was more complicated. Mies had left the country in 1938, after the Nazis shut down the Bauhaus. He'd never built in Germany again. In fact, he'd never even gone back. So when West Berlin invited him to design the new National Gallery, it wasn't just about hiring a famous architect. It was a symbolic gesture, almost a reconciliation, a way of acknowledging that the modernism once condemned and driven out by fascism was now part of Germany's cultural identity. Mies accepted, quietly. No press tour, no grand return, just a quiet yes, and then back to work. What followed would become the starting point for one of the most refined, distilled works of his career. Mies began sketching. By this point in his life, his architectural language was fully formed. He wasn't chasing new styles or trends. He was after clarity and precision, the simplest possible expression of structure and space. And what he proposed for Berlin was exactly that. Let's take a moment to talk about the building itself. From the street, all you see is a large open pavilion sitting on a granite podium. that gives the whole structure a monolithic presence. A perfect 64 by 64 meters roof, supported by 8 steel columns, 2 on each side, but none on the corners, making the huge structure seem weightless. To seal this space from the outside, a continuous glass wall on all sides, inset from the roof's edge. A classic Miesian signature found on so many of his buildings. Other than that, nothing. No ornament, no partitions, just one vast, empty room. At first glance, it didn't even look like a museum. It looked like a temple, or a manifesto, or both. The actual galleries, the space where the art would live, weren't upstairs in the glass pavilion. They were below, tucked into the stone podium that the whole building rests on, and opening to a patio on the west side, its own private outdoor exhibition space. The upper floor wasn't about function, it was about experience, about creating a space that felt open, democratic, and timeless. This idea, this concept, didn't come out of nowhere, though. A few years earlier, Mies had already explored a very similar spatial idea and volumetric approach in a project that almost no one saw, and that was never built. In the late 1950s, Mies had designed an office building for the Bacardi Company in Santiago de Cuba. It had the same weightless roof, the same steel and glass openness, and the same sense of radical simplicity. But the Bacardi project never left the drawing table. As the Cuban Revolution unfolded, the project was first delayed and eventually canceled. But its core ideas stayed with Mies. And now, in Berlin, he found the perfect place to realize them. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Museum officials were concerned. Where would the walls go? How would they hang paintings in a space with no surfaces? What about climate control, or security, or acoustics? Many of the important things in a traditional museum seem to have been ignored here. And Mies listened. But he didn't bend. The upper space was not meant to be a white box gallery. It was meant to be free of walls, free of hierarchy, free of distraction. Construction began in 1965. And like everything with Mies, the challenge wasn't about complexity. It was about precision. When your entire design depends on perfect alignments, seamless joints, and exact proportions, there's nowhere to hide. The steel roof structure, vast, heavy, yet designed to feel weightless, had to be fabricated off-site and assembled with surgical care. The 8 cruciform columns weren't just supports. They were the only visible vertical elements. They had to be flawless. And the glass walls, inset from the roof, had to appear effortless. Inside, the technical systems, climate control, lighting, security, had to be concealed without disturbing the architecture. There was no suspended ceiling, no service corridors, no mechanical distractions. Everything had to be integrated into the bones of the building. And as the work progressed, Berlin watched. Critics and skeptics kept on raising questions. Was it too empty? Too abstract? Would visitors understand it? Could it even function as a museum? But when it opened in 1968, the Neue Nationalgalerie didn't need to explain itself. There it was, a perfect square of steel and glass, a temple to space and light. Mies van der Rohe attended the opening. He was 82 by then, frail, in a wheelchair, quiet as always. He had returned to Berlin one last time. Not as the Bauhaus director chased out by the Nazis, but as one of the most respected architects in the world. And this building, back in his homeland, would be the last one he ever saw completed. He died just a year later in 1969. At first, people weren't quite sure what to make of it. Some were in awe. Others found it cold, empty, even alienating. although that was probably influenced by the critics they read. And hey, in a way they were right. If you tried to judge the building as a typical museum, it just didn't follow many of the standards. But Mies never saw the Neue Nationalgalerie as a typical museum. He saw it as a space for thought, a frame for time, a place where modern art and modern life could breathe. But beyond the debates about architecture, the building started to take on a role that went beyond its program. In Cold War Berlin, the Neue Nationalgalerie became a kind of cultural flag planted in the West. It didn't mimic the classical grandeur of the East. It didn't compete with history. It looked forward. It became a venue not just for art, but for ideas, hosting exhibitions, performances, even political events. It was a place of openness in a city built on division. And then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. A new era began, and the Neue Nationalgalerie was still standing. No longer a symbol of the West, it became something more subtle, a reminder of restraint, of order, of enduring ideals, a building that didn't need to change to remain relevant. Through the 1990s and 2000s, it became a landmark in the truest sense of the word, a fixed point in a rapidly changing city. And while Berlin expanded, styles evolved, and tastes shifted, the Neue Nationalgalerie remained what it had always been. Still, silent, and uncompromising. A building that doesn't try to be more than it is, but also a building that never settles for being less. Over 50 years later, the Neue Nationalgalerie is still doing what it was meant to do. Whispering, not shouting, inviting you in, but never telling you what to think. And in a world of growing noise and distraction, this silence can be very powerful. A building that holds art, but is also, unmistakably, a work of art itself. And that's a wrap on today's episode of Architecture Topics. If this story gave you something to think about, or just a moment to slow down and appreciate good design, consider following the show wherever you're listening. I'm Liam Karen. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep looking up.